So what exactly is the meaning of the term DevOps, and why are the concepts it represents spreading like wildfire throughout the technical community? Good questions indeed. We thought it was time to take a hard look at DevOps in an effort to increase awareness, understanding, and to help dispel some of the confusion surrounding it. According to Gartner, the DevOps market is on a path to significant growth and is set to soon become a mainstream strategy employed by 25% of Global 2000 organizations. So, let's sit back and learn all about this rising trend in software development. This program features expert Bob Aiello, a consultant and software engineer specializing in software process improvement, including software configuration and release management. He has more than 25 years of experience as a technical manager at top New York City financial services firms, where he held company-wide responsibility for configuration management. He is vice chair of the IEEE 828 Standards Working Group on CM Planning and a member of the IEEE Software and Systems Engineering Standards Committee Management Board. There are several teaching points in this program. First, we'll look to define the term DevOps and discuss its origins. Then, a discussion about the benefits of DevOps as well as the challenges it presents to development teams. Next, we'll talk about what it takes to get a DevOps environment up and running successfully. And finally, we'll conclude by presenting advice and best practices to keep in mind as you ramp up your DevOps effort. Now, let's begin our report. In our first segment, we'll look to define the term DevOps and learn about its origins. So, what does the development community think about DevOps? To find out, let's consider the results of a recent survey that concludes companies using DevOps simply have much better IT. The survey was sponsored by Puppet Labs, ThoughtWorks, and IT Revolution, who quizzed some 9,200 respondents from 110 countries about DevOps. Survey questions ranged from asking about an organization's level of DevOps experience to a developer's level of job satisfaction. In summary, here are the survey results as reported in an article by technology writer Jonathan Vanian. Of the 9,200 individuals surveyed, 16% indicated they were part of DevOps departments. Of that 16%, 55% identified themselves as being DevOps or systems engineers. Over 90% of people involved with DevOps departments are part of companies in which there is good IT performance. The survey revealed that the majority of folks working in DevOps departments are from smaller-sized companies with around 20 to 499 employees. Based on the data, the survey sponsors concluded that having DevOps practices in place improves IT performance. Now, let's turn to our expert, software engineer and DevOps expert, Bob Aiello, to learn more about this interesting and important topic. Well, Bob, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. It's my pleasure to be here.
Let me get things started by asking you, how did you come to be an evangelist for the concept we've come to know as DevOps?
Well, I've always been interested in technology and process. That's really where I started my career. And I guess about 15 or 20 years ago, I became really involved with the whole configuration management industry and started writing and really being an evangelist for configuration management. And that has really been the space that has led to DevOps. So that has been something that I've just really always related to and found as important. And it's a really fun way to really drive your technology career because you get to touch every aspect of the system.
Well, I'm sure you would agree that we are hearing more and more about DevOps every day. Developers, operation engineers, and technologists are clearly embracing it. And perhaps more importantly, they are also being successful with it. That being said, my sense is that there is still some confusion out there as to how to define DevOps. So let's just take a moment to help viewers understand. Bob, what exactly is DevOps?
Well, there's basically three definitions of DevOps that are very common in the industry right now. The first I characterize as three guys in a dorm room who are deploying their own code to production. And obviously that's never going to work if you're a big bank or a financial services firm that would actually break federal regulatory requirements. So that's kind of a silly definition, but it's one that's kind of prevalent. And the second definition is really a function within the operations organization where you have some very skilled engineers who automate the whole build, package, and deploy. And if we talk about the IDLE v3 framework, that typically is the release and deployment management group. So that's the second definition of DevOps, a team in the operations group that has programming skills who can really automate the whole deployment pipeline. That is a valid definition of DevOps. The third definition is where I really spend all of my time. I generally work in organizations where they have some great development resources, some really smart people, and they've got some operations resources who do a great job of keeping the systems reliably up and running and so forth. And I help those two teams understand why they've got some conflict and what kind of problems they're having. And I help those two teams interact more effectively. I look for what are the reasons that they're stumbling or having trouble. And I typically get them sharing a WebEx, sharing the same screen, and acting as a high-performance, cross-functional team. So that's really the definition of DevOps that I focus on most of the time.
So then what's the backstory on DevOps? What did it evolve from?
Well, DevOps kind of evolved over time from some of the conferences and a real focus on being able to update websites more quickly, provide instantaneous changes. And there were some conferences in 2009 and later, an O'Reilly conference was another good source. So that's been one of the backdrops of DevOps. Another has been what's called agile administration and being able to do infrastructure as code where you write a program to build your server from scratch. And those, again, those are some of the origins. What's really driven the DevOps transformation, though, is agile development. Now, DevOps works fine in waterfall. I worked in lots of waterfall organizations. We did DevOps, and it was great. But if you're doing agile development, you cannot survive without the speed and accuracy that a true DevOps approach gives you. And let me tell you, one of the key aspects of this is I'm going to get the developers and the operations guys to really share what they know in a very collaborative fashion. And we can build automation to build, package, and deploy our code in a much more reliable and secure way if we get those two teams to kind of meld their knowledge and work together more effectively.
Well, Bob, the potential sounds great, but aren't there some real challenges with operating in a DevOps environment?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, Mike, is being able to get teams to realize that even though they're in different organizational silos, now they're going to work as a cross-functional team. And what's kind of interesting about that is I'm not an advocate of changing the organizational structure. A lot of times the structures exist for very good reasons, and there are some thought leaders in the agile space who think that the approach should be that we actually merge operations and development together. I don't advocate that at all. I think what we want to do is keep those organizational structures in place. For regulatory reasons, you have to have a separation of controls. There are good reasons why companies are set up the way they are, particularly, again, if you're a big bank or a trading firm, a financial services firm. But what I do instead is get those teams on the same call and the same working sessions, and I get them working together toward a common goal. So instead of playing volleyball with each other where development does their thing and they throw it over the net to operations, they do their thing and throw it back, and then we finger point at each other so we kind of blame each other for things going wrong. Instead, the team is held accountable for a successful result.
Okay, Bob, I'm curious. You have degrees in both computer science and industrial psychology. How does that impact the approach to your work in general, and specifically with DevOps?
Well, I've got kind of a unique background. When I was growing up, I had a type of inoperable cataract, and I had to really go through high school and college being functionally blind. I could see some shapes and shadows. I never really saw my mom. I got through school by using tapes and recordings, a little braille, and occasionally some large print. So I had to always think about process. Process was really essential to me. And I went into computers because I knew the computers were going to be able to speak at one point. And that was going to be my hedge against, just in case I couldn't see as I was growing up. I knew I could have a job in computers. And then I became interested in psychology because process really depends upon people skills. And I was fascinated by the lessons that we can learn in industrial psychology about how groups work and how organizations work, and taking those experiences growing up with a difficult handicap that I had to overcome major obstacles. I've kind of merged the software engineering and the industrial psychology to come up with a methodology that addresses both the technical side and also the people side that really ends up being an extremely important factor if you're going to get these changes through in your organization.
Next, we'll discuss the benefits of DevOps as well as the challenges it presents to development teams. To illustrate the exceptional benefits that can be derived from embracing the DevOps environment, IBM recently published an interesting case study. The DevOps success story featured Cars.com, a company you have likely heard about and possibly utilized to help with the selection and purchase of a new car or used vehicle. According to IBM, the website of the Chicago-based company is visited by 11 million users per month. Cars.com offers consumers very detailed info on what car or truck to buy, where to buy, and how much to pay. Cars.com's experience with DevOps began with a need to eliminate a backload of development projects, improve efficiency, and boost developer morale. To accomplish this, the company first committed to shift its development process from the traditional waterfall method to an agile methodology. Then, with the support of IBM and IBM business partner Ascendant Technology, Cars.com implemented IBM Rational Build Forge and IBM Rational Automation Framework software. The end result was that Cars.com decreased the time to deploy releases by 77%. The company now averages 300 new product releases a year versus the 30 to 40 it deployed in the past. To hear more about the benefits and some of the challenges DevOps brings to the table, let's return to our expert, Bob Aiello, and learn more. So, Bob, for example, let's say that things are just fine in my development shop. Why do I need DevOps? What are the benefits?
Well, are they fine, Mike? I mean, really, a lot of times people say that to me, but then I'll ask them, if I were to sit down and talk with some folks in your team, what would they tell me? I had a team recently say to me, our QA process is so backlogged that we can't get stuff tested. So when we have an emergency fix, we slip in 100 lines of extra code and slip in some changes that are untested because it takes too long to go through the QA process. If I sat down and talked with members of your team and I asked them what's going well and what could be improved, I bet I'd find out that there's a lot of challenges. And you just have to open up any magazine or newspaper today and you'll read about a system, a major system that's had problems, or it's been infiltrated by hackers. And let me throw down the gauntlet here, because if you're doing DevOps right, your systems, if they're hacked, you'll know right away and you'll be able to fix it right away. And I'll go into more detail on that. But truthfully, even if you're going to tell me your team is doing great, I bet we could find places where things could be improved.
Well, now, IT professionals are very focused on security issues. I'm told that DevOps can help address security risk factors very well. Tell us how.
Sure. And this is something that really needs to be a common methodology. And honestly, when I teach these classes at conferences, I usually have 4 or 5 people from whatever company has been in the newspaper from getting hacked recently. Using DevOps, I can come up with techniques to make the deployment of my code extremely deterministic. I embed what are called immutable version IDs into every component that I build so I can prove the code really got there. And us techies know sometimes when you push 1,000 files out there, 999 get there, but one doesn't get there because you don't have the right privs or somebody accidentally overwrites it. I had one time when someone accused me of stopping the world economy because I had promoted 2 scripts that were the wrong version onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And the guy said to me, basically, you blew up the New York Stock Exchange and the entire world economy couldn't trade for an hour just because of your mistake. So this manager asked me to go take a look at what I had done. When we ran my scripts, we found there were 2 shell scripts that had been overwritten by somebody else. And we were able to immediately figure out what went wrong and fix it right away. So these techniques that I'm describing, the secure, trusted application base, they allow us to use cryptography effectively and be very deterministic on how we build our systems, detect unauthorized changes, and then very quickly rebuild the whole system if we have to, making whatever malware that was dumped on that server gone. Because we're able to, we don't have to hunt and peck for where the bad code is. We can rebuild the server from scratch. And that's a key competency that really every company has to adopt. DevOps can't be optional anymore. It's really a must-have unless you want to let your competitors basically beat you out by delivering those core functions and having better reliability and security than you do.
Well, Bob, you have sold me on DevOps. Now exactly how do I get started?
Well, the first thing I do when I'm working with a team is that I don't assume that things are bad. I sit down, I do an assessment. I ask them what's going well, what could be improved. I ask them to give me actually a pretty good dance card of people that I can talk to, the developers. Remember, sometimes the guy in the weeds really has a lot of useful information, so it shouldn't just be your dev managers. It should be your testers. It should be your product managers. I kid people, sometimes a janitor knows what's really going on. You know, every stakeholder in the organization has a voice, and when I do my assessment, I try to get as wide a list of players, and I'll ask them what's going well, what could be improved, and then I compare those practices to the guidance that I see in the extremely well thought out IEEE standards. And full disclosure, I'm on the management board of the IEEE, but you look at IEEE standards or ISO standards or IDLE v3 or SOC COBIT, these industry standards and frameworks give you great guidance. So I assess where are you now, where should you really be, and then I help the team create the roadmap to be able to build a completely automated build, package, and deployment pipeline.
And what are the steps toward full implementation?
Well, one of the things that we're really working on in the industry, and something that I've been very focused on, and certainly always glad to interact with my colleagues on this, is coming up with a maturity model for what DevOps is. And a lot of times people will tell me they're doing DevOps, and then I'll say to them, well, can you describe that? And it'll turn out they're just doing the dev part. They didn't really involve ops. And they're doing a great job of deploying to the development test environments, and everything falls apart when they go to production. So we really have to look at what all the practices are. What are the things we really have to have? Are you doing the same thing in the development test and all the way up to production in every single environment? Or do you have great processes in the beginning and then crummy processes in the end? Are the operations guys, are they getting started in the very beginning? Are they getting up to speed? Are they learning? Is your team afraid to let you know when things are wrong? So when I look at process maturity, I'm looking at a combination of technical and interpersonal factors that tell me whether or not that team is really capable of deploying code as often as you need to and getting it right each and every time.
Okay, so once you're up and running, how do you scale DevOps for larger development projects?
Well, one of the great things about technology professionals is they just love to share. So I actually create like an open source group within every company that I work for, and I get the different teams to kind of use peer pressure and help each other. And a lot of times I find if I can grab somebody from one group and get them to help another group. So a lot of this is really taking that community open source culture and embedding it in an organization. And that takes a little help from the senior managers to allow their staff to help other teams. But I build that learning organization. I build that knowledge culture. And the number one thing I do if I'm going to help that team scale is I drive out fear. As Deming said, Deming was a father of quality management. I really have to get every stakeholder in the organization at a point where they're not afraid to say if they see something wrong, and they know that they can speak up. And that's really key if the organization is going to scale these practices and be successful.
Bob, tell us about the type of IT skills individuals would need to work in a DevOps environment.
Well, it's an interesting combination for a DevOps guru. First off, you got to be, a person who can write scripts to automate things. You got to be good at automating things. But you also have to have a process orientation where you don't just focus on doing it once, you focus on being able to, I describe it like this. Developers are good at running up the mountain once. As a DevOps guy, I follow that guy up the mountain the first time, and I make sure we can run up that same mountain each and every time without tripping. So I create the repeatable process. Plus, a DevOps person looks at the whole system, what we call a systems view. So that means you're interested in user interface and the GUI, you're interested in the back end, you're interested in the operating system, because the weakest link in a chain any part of that can break is going to cause you problems. So a DevOps person has a broad, technical, hands-on background, but just loves interacting in a team environment. It's kind of football for techies.
It would seem to me that in order to get a DevOps-type environment up and running successfully, it will take a manager with great leadership skills. Describe for us the characteristics of an effective team leader in a DevOps environment.
Mike, that's a very good point. And without leadership, frankly, I don't see how a team is going to do this. I mean, DevOps has to come from the ground up and from the top down. And the leaders, a lot of times I'll sit down with the CTO and I'll have to have a heart-to-heart with him and say, you've got to communicate to your team that first off, they're free to speak up, that there's no fear if they made a mistake that nothing bad is going to happen. Because if we get people admitting when they've made mistakes, we are a long way down the road to fixing those mistakes. Mistakes are not bad, particularly if you learn from them. So the leader has to set the environment. He has to set the culture. He has to let it be known that he's more interested in developing human capital, successful technology professionals who love helping each other. That's the kind of culture that has to be in that organization. And if the leader doesn't set that type of culture, nobody else can. So really, leadership is essential in this. And, you know, the technology professionals add a lot to that, but without the right leader, I don't think they can be successful.
And more specifically, what are the key skills a team leader needs to be truly effective?
So it's really communication, it's really empowering, it's knowledge sharing. When I'm leading a team like this, if somebody comes to me with a problem, I will always say to them, well, why don't you tell me how you would handle it? I'm always getting that person to take a swing at the pitch. And if I really think they're headed down the wrong path, I'll tell them right away. But I never allow them to come to me with a problem. They always have to come with at least their first cut at a solution. So you're building people, you're developing people, you're helping them. Sometimes I'm helping people with the way they communicate in English. Sometimes I'm helping people communicate in writing. A lot of it is really how do we interact with each other. And, sometimes it's very simple stuff. It's I had a technology professional one time. He just didn't speak English well, so he ignored error messages on the screen. So I've got to really look at the whole person and help find a plan to empower that person and develop them and make them the best that they can be.
When development and operations teams implement DevOps, they are essentially organizing into self-managing cross-functional teams. That type of change might not sit well with stakeholders who want to keep things status quo. How do you work around a challenge like that?
Well, that's something that comes across almost every time that I'm working with a team, because a lot of times the managers feel threatened. They feel like we're infringing on their fiefdoms, and frankly, sometimes I feel like a horse trader. I'll sit down with each group and I'll ask them, what are the things that you're trying to do, and I'll actually try to get one team to agree to do something for the other team. I'm looking at it from each team's perspective and trying to see what's in it for them and almost marketing it to them as a solution. So frankly, a lot of this is really selling and marketing what's in it for each group, and most of all, finding a way for them to be comfortable with the changes that are going to happen.
We'll now conclude with best practices to keep in mind as you ramp up your DevOps effort. In today's report, we began by explaining and defining DevOps and discussing its origins. We explored the benefits of DevOps and examined the challenges it can present to development teams. Then we talked about what it takes to get a DevOps environment up and running successfully. To conclude, let's ask our expert for best practices to keep in mind as you ramp up a DevOps environment. Well, Bob, DevOps doesn't happen overnight, and you have written that, like any change, it may be a little rocky at first. Just give us a list of best practices we should keep in mind as we ramp up a DevOps environment.
So one of the best practices is known as left shift. That's where I get the operations team involved earlier in the process. So while there's development test environments that are usually handled by the developers, my point of view is if somebody's going to have to deploy to the development test environment, why not let that be the guy who's going to deploy to production? Let him get involved earlier. As you're moving him up into the development lifecycle, let him get that practice. Let him help to automate everything. And then by the time he gets to the upper environments like UAT and then eventually production, He's gotten a lot of experience and really understands how to do it well. He's gained that knowledge and had that practice. The biggest mistake I see companies make is they do a great job in the early development environments, and then when they get to the upper environments, they just haven't had the time to bake in those procedures and fully automate them and getting them working successfully. So another important best practice is to make sure that your deployment method is the same across all environments. So whatever you're going to do for development test and then QA and then integration and user acceptance tests and eventually production, you want the same procedure. That's one of the key aspects that DevOps really promotes. Have the same procedure across all environments. And that's really important, and that takes a little bit of effort. Now, I've coined a phrase, right shift. I mean, everybody talks about left shift in the industry. Sometimes operations has some great procedures that they use to run those big production systems. I get those guys to share that with development, and sometimes bringing that into the development world helps the developers get their code running faster. You know, for example, are my servers all up? Am I running out of storage? Am I running out of memory? Sometimes the ops guys have got some technical knowledge that'll help the developers. And so sharing in both directions is really key to DevOps.
What about focusing on reliability as a best practice?
Reliability is the most important aspect of DevOps. I want to be able to update my systems in a way that I have absolutely zero downtime. Now, some of my colleagues in the industry talk about push-button deploys. They have this concept of I want to be able to just have one button I push and the code goes rippling through all the way through to production. Frankly, I don't necessarily agree with that approach. If somebody's going to sit there and press enter a few times, that's often perfectly fine. The focus has to be, did I really create a fully reliable method for doing my deploy? Think of the cockpit of an airplane. Those instruments are set up so that the pilot cannot make a mistake. We have to do the same thing when we deploy code. So when I write this code, better than half the lines in my script test all the previous steps to make sure that every step completed successfully and to immediately get feedback if something is wrong.
Oh, continuous testing is important too, correct?
Continuous testing is another aspect that is really critical, and that actually refers to the fact that we need unit testing, we need functional testing, but both of those are kind of limited. We have another methodology that's really evolving called API testing, where we get deeper into the weeds, and service virtualization testing, where we're creating mocks or test artifacts that are always available even when the real systems are not. So continuous testing really refers to improving the way that we automate our testing throughout the whole life cycle, and DevOps depends upon continuous testing because you must be able to test more quickly and frequently, because DevOps is going to have you deploy more frequently. Without that automated testing infrastructure, you cannot be successful in DevOps.
And Bob, how about incremental process improvement? Would that be a valid best practice?
It's a journey. Creating a DevOps culture and the DevOps transformation, you got to start with some small hits. I usually tell people, don't try to fix the biggest problems you have. Fix a couple of small things. Get the team used to the fact that things can change and improve. And I usually take an agile, iterative approach to implementing DevOps, where with each release we try to get a little bit better. And what I find is that when teams see that there's been a little bit of progress, they get excited. They start volunteering ideas of what we could fix on the next release. We use an iterative approach to really develop the DevOps automation to support the whole development effort.
So, Bob, a final thought for our viewers?
Well, I think that the most important thing, Mike, is to start off by understanding where you are today. You can't really get to your location unless you understand where you're coming from, as an old adage says. So it's important to understand where you are today, and don't assume that everything is broken, because you likely have some things that your team is doing really, really well. And it's important for the team to understand that you respect them, that you hear their voice, that you're not just fixing things randomly. So a lot of times I prefer to have the team tell me what they'd like to improve, and I can kind of guide that a bit. But if I can get the team to volunteer what we should improve, even through a little bit of fancy footwork, I'm more likely to help that team head in the right direction. So this is not just about improving the technology. It's all about how to improve how your organization and your human capital, the key people that you're paying to get the job done, it's all about helping them be more effective. And the net result is what I always call a cross-functional, high-performance team.
Bob Aiello, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on this interesting topic.
Thanks, Mike. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Well, that concludes our report, Understanding DevOps. I'm Michael Quinlan, and thanks so much for watching.